Welcome to our new State Lab series on recreating the apocalyptic code, discerning a Christian organization towards the future. We're kind of a few technical circles right now. So I want to open things up by engaging with you a little bit more directly. And by the way, this will not only help make this session more fruitful for all of us, but also give an indication to me about where future sessions should go. So this series has been offered at Breathing the Apocalypse. And the apocalypse, it could be a word we're going to unpack a little bit about more later. But it's taken from the title of the New Testament books, the Revelation, or the Revelation of John, not Revelations, but simply Apocalypse, the Apocalypse of John. Actually, its title is the Apocalypse of Jesus Christ. All that to lead us to a question that I want to ask you. Have you ever read the book of Revelation? Yes? What comes to mind? Death, the destruction. Okay, the impressions from the book of Revelation are certainly there's plenty of death and destruction in that. What else conjures up from your memory, or maybe just things you've heard about the strange chaos? Chaos? Yep.
Final battle, which be
Final battle. There's a lot of battle type stuff, which would go along with all the carnage, or all the decimation and all the death and so forth. Be ready. Be ready. There is a message in the book of Revelation, which is why it is, despite its oddness. Can we add that word, odd? Would that be everybody's experience in the book of Revelation? It is an odd one, so that raises the question, why is it even in Scripture? And here's another one. Why is it written that way? Do you know what I'm talking about? If you read the book of Revelation, it is what we call not just high context composition, extremely high context composition. That is a sociologist's term that means a certain cultural artifact, like a joke. I'm not talking about the book of Revelation, but a joke is a conversational device that we practice, and jokes are always very high context, which is why if you take a certain joke out of its own context and you try to make that joke work in a different context, if you've ever done translation from one language to another, you've seen this happen where you're supposed to tell a joke that originated in one language, it just doesn't work in the other language. That's high context. Okay, now take high context and just inject that with steroids, and you've got the book of Revelation. It is extremely high context. This is a signal to us. Any composition that is going to be taken seriously, that comes from such a high context generative matrix, calls for a certain way of reading, or at least it cautions us about the varieties of ways of reading a high context composition. At the very least, what we're called upon to do with a book like Revelation is to make sure that we're reading it according to, or in accordance with, or aligned with the contours of the context into which it was generated. That's just common sense. But if you know anything about the way the book of Revelation is read popularly, you know common sense has nothing to do with that. Okay. So in this series, I want to welcome you to it. We're going to have we're projecting 5 sessions. Okay. First session starting today, we're going to be our aim is to do it all over a 5-week stretch. A Christian orientation toward the future. First, to prepare ourselves, and we just made the case for the necessity to be prepared for understanding book of Revelation. We will equip ourselves, this is today, God willing, we will equip ourselves with basic conceptual tools for breaking the apocalypse code. That's another chestnut, breaking the code. We'll be learning what I call the grammar of that code, as found in the Old Testament book of Daniel. And now, if you haven't read the book of Daniel lately, don't worry. I'll treat you gently. But if you know the way I tend to work with these Faith Lab series is I will have a big barrel of information. I'm just going to dunk you in that information. And at some point, even in today's session, It might be overwhelming. Don't worry. I promise you, it will all come together. And for today's session, I strongly urge you, if you can, stay for the very last moments. That's when the payoff will be regarding our topic for today and the book of Daniel. Are we good? Second session, come back next week, I hope. Jesus picks up that grammar in one of his orations that is preserved in the Gospel of Matthew. So we're going to listen to him as he speaks in that, if I make, in that dialect or in that manner of expression regarding a Christian orientation towards the future. Third session, will finally be devoted to the entire session, devoted to the book of Revelation. See what we can learn, having been equipped by the writers of the book Daniel and Jesus himself. Then we skip a week for the blessing of the animals. Everyone who missed that. And we come back following that to consider the ancient sources like the Bible are not the only ones who've been talking about the end of the world or where things will go. This is actually a very lively subject for modern cosmology and modern science. So if we're going to craft a Christian orientation toward the future, we are well advised, this would be our future. We are well advised to take into account what scientists say about our future and our children's future and our grandchildren's future and so forth. Finally, the fifth week, God willing, we will connect the dots, connecting what we've learned to explore what a Christian orientation towards the future would look like for our time and for our mission. Does everybody have a handout? Yes? This handout is for reference for throughout today's session. And I'll be referring you to that as we proceed. Let's just go ahead and start. The clock is ticking. What? Now, just so you know, in a popular debate, they keep there is a sign. And signs are always in need of interpretation. And I choose to interpret that as a divine endorsement of what we're about. Yes. Apocalypse. I've already told you what the root of the word comes from. It connotes, as you already told me, mass destruction, societal collapse, leaving an anarchic world where people fend for themselves. This is the general connotation that the word apocalypse is tended to gather around itself. There's widespread anxiety about, technological change, rapid social change, and ecological limits, and so forth. So are we approaching the end of the world as not a lame question by any means? It's on people's minds. Are we living in the last days? It is a legitimate question. By the way, even if you're religious or not, it's bubbling up. Is this our future? And some people say yes. This is Peter Thiel. He is a tech billionaire. Here's another one, Sam Altman. He's a tech billionaire. Here's the one we love to hate, Mark Zuckerberg. All these, what they have in common is they are investing a lot of money in building their own bunkers, their own in New Zealand, Hawaii, at some place, because they evidently anticipate something like the end of the world. Their efforts to preserve themselves, which is, by the way, a trend among many elite across the world, tells us something about them, and that is they do believe something about the apocalypse is at end. And their solution and their response is what I would call bunkerism. So here's a shot of what it's like to live inside some of the bunkers that are available if you care to miss out on, well, the end of the world. So are they right? Are our times the end times? So what we're going to do in this session is develop some conceptual tools to begin to address this question. First of all, the end times. This can mean a lot of different things, but we're talking about generally the end of history, and there's a technical term that's used, eschatology. You'll hear me using that term. Eschaton means the end. Eschatology means talking about the end. Eschatological means referring to the end, and usually it means the end of the world. There can also be personal eschatons. This is at some point each one of us will die, and that will be our own personal eschaton. And we had a whole faith series on that called Welcome to Hell. Here it is a far more global horizon we're considering when we're talking about eschatology. This question then has been responded to in the Christian tradition, largely by reference to the book of Revelation and other parts of the Bible and theology. And there's no single answer to that question as far as Christian response is concerned. On your handouts, handout A, I provided a handy summary of the basic approaches to this question on the part of evangelical Protestants and non-evangelical Protestants, Eastern Orthodox Christians, and Roman Catholic Christians. This is just a general overview, not for us to study right now, but for your reference where at your leisure. The answers, it turns out, are all over the map. So here's the question: do you believe we're living in the end times? So this is yes, and this is no. And as you can see, it's all over the map. It kind of depends on who you talk to. And by the way, as pertains to those different Christian responses, it largely revolves around how you read the book of Revelation, a matter of how literally read it, and how non-literally you read it. So let's back up. Where did the idea, by the way, this is real quick, you have historically black, absolute, a huge majority, we are living in the end times. We have mainline Protestants, not really. You have agnostics and atheists, not really. You have evangelical Protestants, absolutely, are a great majority. So there's a wide view here. We would be wise to back up and just ask ourselves, where do we even get the idea of the end of the world? How common is that, and how is that even thought about? Well, it turns out it's an ubiquitous, the gods must be crazy, is that movie, a ubiquitous etymological phenomena. Everywhere we go, everywhere we find civilizations emerging all over the globe, indigenous civilizations, great Scythid civilizations, Native American traditions, all over the place. There's a great variety here, but there is a commonality. And what you typically find is on the observation of life cycles, humans have always reasoned basically along the lines of, okay, it just kind of goes like a cycle. There's the emergence of the world, and there's the life of the world, as there's a death of the world, and there's an emergence of the world, and there's life, and there's death. Various permutations on that basic cyclical conception of, let's call it global history, or the history of the world. The Abrahamic traditions are different. They arose here in the Middle East, and by Abrahamic traditions, I mean Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And in these traditions, they don't really subscribe to the endless cycles view of how history works. Time moves forward in a unique, unrepeatable consummation, or towards a consummation. The end of the current created order itself is radically transformed in the end, which is not just a cosmic transformation, but a moral transformation as well. Again, this is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There is a final reckoning, a judgment of human deeds, leading to some damnation for some and salvation for others. So here, in this conception, this is the Abrahamic tradition's trajectory. History has a purpose. Its end, eschaton, telos, if you will, is not just termination, the consummation, the fulfillment of divine intent. So the Abraham traditions offer a kind of hope, not just that life will go on after destruction, but that God will redeem history itself, both personal and global. That is something you're going to find in various permutations in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So since that tradition is the one that has informed our current awareness of eschatology and the eschaton anyway, we will focus on that trajectory and focus specifically on the Bible. So how did we come to think about eschatology in this way? That is to say, it has an end that will be consummate. It boils down to Israel's experience, this Old Testament Israel, their experience of geopolitical history. Geopolitical history, he said. What's that got to do with any of this? Unlike, all peoples have stories about how they came to be and how they relate in the world in which they find themselves. In Israel's story, they introduced an historical, directional historical movement in their storytelling about themselves, beginning with a certain verse in the Bible, and this is on your handout B, or sheet B in your handout. This is the story against Abraham, Genesis, where Abram, who had been living in Mesopotamia, receives a word from God telling him, I want you, God says to Abram, I want you to go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. You read it there? And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you are to be a blessing. God will bless Abram by giving Abram plenty of children, and those children will go on to become a great nation. And notice that nation has a purpose for being, and it's in bold print at the end of that quote. My job, God says, is to bless you. Your job is to be a blessing. To all the families of the earth. So this is a mission that's given to history, if you will. History has a forward-moving expectation that is generated by the dynamic of the fulfillment of divine promise. What moves the story forward is the concern with this question. Once Abram received that promise, the question is, what will become of God's promise? And the historiography adopted by the biblical writer from Genesis to Revelation is meant to trace its fate and the destiny of that question. What will happen to God's promise when Sarah, Abram's wife, can't have any children? What will happen to God's promise when Abram's descendants are enslaved in Egypt? Homeless. What will happen to God's promise? And so forth and so on. And in every case, the challenge to God's promise in the overarching story of the Bible is always geopolitical powers. For example, what I just referenced, the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt, the most powerful geopolitical presence on earth at the time. And that continues. So if we equip ourselves, we're going to become more familiar with the geopolitical powers of biblical history. This is more donkey in the barrel. So here's a time mark. Geopolitical powers of biblical history. We're going to start to finish real quickly. First, there's the Egyptian that I just referenced. You can see a time frame around 1200 BC. Then the Israelites are free after Moses in the time of David and Solomon and so forth. So we have an Israelite kingdom during the 1000 going to the 900s, 800s. But that comes to an end eventually because Assyria, another super geopolitical power, arises and conquers the northern kingdom of Israel. So part of Israel is under pagan rule. They are followed by the Babylonians, more of the same, and they end up conquering Jerusalem. Followed by the Persians, more of the same, with slightly different policy. The point is, God's people who received the promise are constantly living under challenges to that promise. If you get it? And these are geopolitical challenges. Virtually every page is reflecting this. They are followed by the Greeks after Alexander, which is also going to be challenging for a brief moment in the 2nd century. first century, there's freedom for the Jews, but that comes to an end when the Romans arrived and remain thereafter under the Roman rule like everybody else did. So we need to focus it. This is an age of empires, and then the next slide is on your handout C. I want to make sure we are dialed into key details that will help us, if you will, break the code. So once again, here is the Assyrian Empire, and they conquered the city of Samaria in the north. This is the capital of the northern kingdom that the narrative is called Israel, as opposed to the southern kingdom, which is called Judah. I don't know how to emphasize this sufficient. The fall of the city in that world is catastrophic. It's unimaginable because everything in the way those civilizations operated, apart from the fields of agriculture, happened in the city. So who was ruling, how they were ruling, and what their policies were of utmost importance to everybody, as they are for us too. So when Samaria falls and the inhabitants of the northern kingdom are to exile, that's a big deal. Then when the Babylonians came about 120, 30 years later, and Jerusalem falls, well, this is the actual Yahweh temple that is taken, and the inhabitants are exiled to Babylon. Now they're no longer in their city worshiping Yahweh in their temple. They're in Babylon among pagans who don't worship Yahweh. What's going to happen to Yahweh's promise? You see how it works. They're followed by the Persians. Things change. Some people go back to Jerusalem. Some people don't. It's still driven by that question. And the prophetic books of the Old Testament are written at this time frame. All of them, I can assure you, addressing in some way the question about, among the geopolitical powers, what is the fate of God's promise? The Greeks come along after Alexander, and things get really bad because, if we're going to explore this, the temple is actually desecrated. And freedom is won in 164. This is the time when the book of Daniel is addressing. So this is another huge, huge deal. More on this later. You finally, when the Romans came, there was a rebellion of Jews against the Romans, and by 69 AD, and 70, the Romans finally had enough. I think you know this. They take Jerusalem, they destroy temple. It's hard to overstate the degree of cataclysm that represents. When your God's temple lies in ruins, what does that say about your God? Meanwhile, Rome's God seems to be the one to worship. What will happen to Yahweh's boss, to the covenant people? It is in the light of the soul of Jerusalem that Jesus elaborates on apocalyptic and all of that, and John's apocalypse does as well. We will focus for the time being on the book of Daniel. So far, so good? Yes. Okay, good. By the way, even if you say nothing, I'm going to think that's good too, sir. I mentioned the Old Testament prophetic books. They talked about this, so I'm going to give you a more refined, focused sense on how did they address this question. The way they addressed the question was largely through announcements of judgment and hope. That is, the end will come, and it will be judgment upon all these other nations that are oppressing us. And that judgment will also at the same time be salvation for us, God's covenant people. So, a prophecy of doom. This is handout D in your sheets. A prophecy of doom for ancient Babylon. This is an expectation that, yes, we are going to be ruled by Babylon, but Babylon will be judged. The Lord of hosts. By the way, Lord of hosts simply means Yahweh of armies. So already you have this battle, this militaristic connotation. Is mustering an army for battle. They come from a distant land, from the land of the heavens, the Lord and the weapons of his indignation. So this is very much battle. This is a war to destroy the whole earth. The wails of the day of the Lord is near. It will come like destructions of the Almighty. This kind of language is drawing upon a deep cultural well that everybody understood at the time, and that is the holy warrior combat myth. We're coming back to this. It is so momentous for understanding our questions about the apocalypse. So you get the idea. There is a notion of a combat carried out by the divine, and it will bring judgment upon, in this case, Babylon. There's also salvation. Other parts of the book of Isaiah, which I'm drawing this from, announce salvation. I'm about to decree a new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. This is not militaristic. This is rather creative. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and delight in my people. No more shall the sound of weeping be heard, and as you hear a redemption sigh, that the end will be something of comfort and restoration. The sound weeping, not no cryable stress. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together. We read this sometimes in church. The lion shall eat straw like the ox. They shall not hurt or destroy. And all my holy mountains, says the Lord. This is drawing upon the creator myth. Again, a deep cultural encyclopedia that's just operating from which these prophets ripe. There's one more major myth that we want to consider, and that is the prophecy of universal judgment. On that day, the Lord will punish the host of heaven in heaven, and on earth the keys of the earth. This is what we would call the divine judge myth. These are three hugely important and ubiquitous notions that people were carrying around in their heads in the ancient periods. So when people like Isaiah make references like this, no one's mystified. They get it. And by the way, of course, they take it seriously. It's a comfort song. Moreover, as you get into the layered parts of the Old Testament, this becomes the scale of Yahweh's justice becomes not just this nation or that king or this city, but the entire cosmos becomes the horizon of Yahweh's just rule and global reality. And so look at the language, the host of heaven. These are the angelic, if you will, the angelic hosts. Whatever powers there are, we answer to, but then they also are subject to some judgment of the divine judge. So with that set of tools, focus now, first in Romans, on the book of Daniel. Book of Daniel took place under the Greek rule in Jerusalem. So I'm taking that previous timeline that I gave you, and I'm just giving this one portion. This is when, after Alexander and his subsequent generals were ruling over the ancient Near East, in Judea, this is when things went not just south, but deeply south, a real catastrophe. It focuses around Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He is one of the Seleucid rulers. So this is Alexander, then the subsequent generals. This is a guy in that line of those subsequent generals. This king that was so bad, he became a byword for the existential catastrophe because of his brutal suppression, unprecedented. The Jews had never seen anything like this. What? Well, here's what I'm talking about. Antiochus ordered, for his own culture war reasons, the construction of a statue of Zeus within the Yahweh temple. And what's the first and second commandment? No other gods, no graven images. So this is not small stuff. This is not, we can just brush this under the rug. This is huge. Including offering of swine on the altar of Yahweh, circumcision prohibited, Sabbath observance prohibited, copies of the Torah burned, Jews compelled to take part in pagan religious ceremonies, including feasts and sacrifice to Greek gods. I would like for you to just really lock that away, because that situation is going to be relevant for our study later of the book of Revelation, so I'll repeat it. Jews were compelled to partake in pagan religious ceremonies under this king, including feasts and sacrifice to gods. And if you didn't, you risked execution. His actions were interpreted not as political oppression, but as cosmic rebellion. Just one moment real quickly. The reality is, when you read the full breadth of historical documents, there were some Jews who were not that bothered by the Hellenization that Antiochus were pushing. There are some Jews at the time who had good reasons to say, look, things have changed. This is a new world. So we adapt our worship of Yahweh to the new cultural situation. There were others who saying, not no, but hell no. There's just too much to sacrifice here. And at what point, it's like Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. How far do you bend before you break, right? So under this king, some people at the time in that cultural struggle among Jews believed that this guy is not just giving us political oppression, but this is actually a rebellion against God, and it forces the question: what's going to happen to God's promise? And so some Jewish writers spoke of cosmic warfare, divine judgment, and the coming of a new righteous age, core themes of apocalyptic thought. In this conception, then, whereas earlier, the world and history, sure, the world is messed up, but history is going to unfold such that in the world to come, there's going to be harmony with God's rule. Okay, this was the older conception. But under the new circumstances, by virtue of kings like Antiochus IV, it's a different eschatology, or an unadjusted eschatology. And that is, this world is messed up. It's in opposition to God's rule. And in the world to come, there will be harmony with God's rule. But before this world to come happens, it's going to be a very tumultuous time. And people like Antiochus IV are a manifestation of what they're talking about here. So this is the moment addressed by early Jewish apocalyptic writings. Is this making sense? Okay. Those early apocalyptic writings adopted various mythological themes and concepts and images in their expression. What are these writings? There's many of them. One of them is the collection of Enoch traditions, not found in our Bibles. That's not true. It's found in Greek, in Ethiopic, Orthodox Ethiopic Bibles, the Enoch tradition, but not in ours. The Testament of Levi, the Sibylline oracles, and the book of Daniel. Well, the book of Daniel is in our Bible. And so let's take a look at it. The book of Daniel was, although it was composed to address this moment, as I said, composed to address this moment, it was written as though it came from the Babylonian Empire. Let me repeat, it's written to a second century audience of struggling Jews. But it's written as though it came from a prophet during the Babylonian exile, so that what the prophet is shown speaks forwardly to the time of the actual book's writing and its actual audience. In that particular compositional frame, the book consists of two parts. Chapters 1 through 6 are stories. And this is usually what we find in our church use of the book of Daniel. Stories about Daniel and his fellow Jews. He has three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they find themselves serving in Babylonian and Persian imperial courts under these kings, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius, and Cyrus. And just real quickly, you know these stories. The first story is these young men the Jews are being trained to serve in the imperial court, and they're given food, and it's not kosher. And so they just stand firm in their Yahweh commitment and say, no, we can't do that. And so they stay true to the Yahweh tradition, and they excel. And they're recognized as being superlative servants in the imperial court. There's another chapter where Daniel has to interpret. The king Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and it's a very confusing dream. No one knows what to make of it. Daniel comes forth, and he has the revelation from God to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and he speaks forth to Nebuchadnezzar the meaning of the dream. There's another story. You know this one. Nebuchadnezzar makes a statue, and he wants everybody to worship the statue. Okay, now notice, this is a geopolitical statement. It's a statement about Babylonian power deserving ultimate allegiance through worship. And that's forbidden in Jewish law. So the three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we all know the story. We tell it to our children. They stand firm. We will not bow down. Our God will save us, and even if our God doesn't save us, we're still not going to bow down. You know the story, and they are regaled. They are received as heroes, and Daniel and his friends are elevated further. There's another story where there's handwriting on the wall under another king, and no one can discern it. And Daniel is brought forth because he has, you see, the gift from God to discern the handwriting, the sign. And it's not good news, but he speaks it forth. He speaks the truth. And then finally, we can't forget this one. Daniel in the lion's den, right? So there's a decree. The king is actually like this king is Darius. He likes Daniel, but he's tricked, and he makes a decree. No one can pray to their God. They can only pray to the king. This is a geopolitical statement. Daniel, of course, everybody knows he's not going to do it. And he's thrown into the lion's den, which is the punishment. He's saved. And the punishment that should have gone to Daniel, it goes to the people who plotted against him. And you get the idea. These stories are absolutely told and absolutely preserved in this collection called the Daniel book in order to Well, it's why we tell them to our children, so that they will be like that. They will stand firm when it's not convenient or comfortable to stand firm. That's what these stories are. The second half of the book are not stories at all. They are Daniel's reports to the reader of visions that he has received during the reigns of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Darius. Now, this is where I'm going to be dunking you pretty deep in this barrel, so just be advised. These stories, these reports of visions, feature key elements of what I'm calling apocalyptic grammar. Remember, today's session, we're equipping ourselves with tools to understand the strange manner of writing that we find in Revelation. So this guy has these visions, and these visions are framed according to apocalyptic grammar, like angelic intermediaries. Okay, here's the description. I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like beryl, his face like the appearance of lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a multitude. This is language designed to enter into our ears and trigger our imaginations, okay? This has always been the case, and artistic depictions of this, which is quite striking, are going to be according to the dictates of the times, whether uh, uh, Dutch masters or Italian masters in earlier years, or our current masters called AI. We see figures like this. So these intermediaries are the ones through whom the divine, who is inaccessible at this point, discloses the realities that cannot be known otherwise. Uh, I promised we'd come back to this. One huge part of apocalyptic grammar is the combat myth scenario. In this scenario, and again, this was the air that people breathed. Everybody, for literally millennia, conceived of things in this way. The story begins, things are ordered, the world is ordered well, and things are thriving. A force of chaos or disorder, some kind of threat to the cosmic order, arises. It's often associated with the sea or the fomenting waters. And the chaos represents unbounded destructive power that must be subdued for creation to flourish. And here, this is an ancient Assyrian depiction of the god who is fighting against the chaos monster. He was a crazy hybrid of what kind of animal is this? It connotes disorder because there are so many elements that are together that shouldn't be together. The warrior god arises after chaos threatens, and there's a battle, and the divine figure of defeats the chaos monster. Chaos is defeated, and order and kingship are established, and victory is celebrated. This appears in various permutations in all kinds of documents, and also in the uh, visions that Daniel receives. So let's jump into one. Uh, yeah, symbolic visions is the next element of apocalyptic grammar. I'm going to just choose chapter 7, the first of the visions that Daniel presents. He says, this is what I saw. I saw these creatures. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. You see the mixture? So this is not quite right. The wings were plucked off, and it was made to stand like a human being. Another beast appeared, a second one looked like a bear, but it had 3 tusks in its mouth among its teeth, disordered. And another strange creature appeared, a leopard. It had 4 wings on its back and 4 heads. So you see, things are getting more and more and more disordered as these sequence of animals proceeds. Now, Daniel asks an intermediary angel, what is this? And by the way, the very fact that he asks and receives an answer tells you where we get this break the code notion. Okay, Daniel has to be shown the meaning of the vision. So we have inherited this conception of, apocalyptic always has this secret information. If we can just get the key and unlock the code, and Dan Brown has made a fortune writing books about that particular motif. After that, and so we have our the 4 beasts, and the sea is typically the source of this kind of geopolitical chaos. So here's a depiction of 4 of these creatures emerging out of the sea. Again, in the ancient conception, the sea is the source of chaos. Out of it, geopolitical powers that render chaos into the world. So this is going to make a lot of sense to those people at that time.
Then I saw a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces, and stamping what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that preceded it. It had 10 horns. Horns in the ancient Near East are always symbols of kingly power, always. Okay, and it had all these horns. And there was another little horn that came up and to make room for it, and it had eyes, and this horn had a mouth. It was speaking arrogantly. So when Daniel asks about this, what the angel, the blue guy, what the angel tells him is these are a sequence of kingdoms. And the description by the angel, the figure, makes it clear that these are the kingdoms that the Jews have been experiencing, culminating in Antiochus IV, who is depicted like this. This is simply an AI depiction of what Daniel described uh, in his vision. Okay, this is the horn with the mouth and so forth. Then he says, I saw a throne, and an ancient one took on his throne. So instantly we're thinking judgment myth. Here we go. And sure enough, Daniel describes this basic scene of thousands upon thousands around this throne, and the court sat in judgment, Daniel tells us, and the books were opened. So we've shifted, from a combat myth orientation to a judgment myth, divine judgment myth orientation. I watched because of the noise of the arrogant word that the horn was speaking. We now know this is Antiochus IV. And I watched, and the beast was put to death, and its body destroyed, given over to be burned with fire. So this is the judgment that's been placed upon Antiochus. And then finally, a human being, not disordered. It's called Baranosh in Aramaic, the Son of Man, would arrive, and to him was given dominion and power. And there was a great celebration. We know that what they've done in these visions is you have a mythologized scenario of the rise and fall of Babylon, then Media, then Persia, and then Alexandrian Greek rule, zeroing in on Antiochus IV. We know that because Daniel asked, and that's the answer he was given. The fate of Antiochus now, here he is from one of his coins, is given. What is that fate? The court shall sit in judgment. There's the myth, check it. And his dominion shall be taken away to be consumed and totally destroyed. And moreover, the kingship and dominion, geopolitical language, will be, and the greatness of the kingdoms, geopolitical language, under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High, the covenant people. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. You see, the world has been upside down with monsters like Antiochus in control, and God's people suffering under them. And it will be righted. So it's the other way around. This is the vision of redemption, which you see both judgment upon the bad and blessing upon the good, those who have stayed true to the covenant. Turns out then that this same sequence is demonstrated here. This is the moment of crisis that this vision depicts, and it shows a good outcome. Real quickly, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but this is what I just showed you. Babylon, lion; bear is Media; Persia is the leopard; Greece is the monster; Antiochus IV is judged by God, and the kingdom dominion is given to the holy ones, inversion of this a world order. That's what I just gave you. It turns out when we keep turning the pages in the book of Daniel, essentially the same sequence is repeated for us. In chapter 8, the Media, using these animals, different animals, Media, Persia, Greece, Antiochus is broken. Chapter 9, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Antiochus is broken. Chapters 10 through 11, Persia, Greece at great lengths, and Antiochus comes to an end, and deliverance and resurrection are given especially for the wise. This guy Antiochus was trying to seduce those who violate the covenant, but the people who are loyal to their God, this is at the end of the Daniel book now, the end of the vision of judgment and redemption, shall stand. The people who are loyal to their God, you see the dynamics among the Jews at the time, stay loyal, stay loyal. They shall stand firm and take action. The wise among the people shall give understanding to many for some days, They, the wise, shall fall by the sword and flame and suffer captivity and plunder. And there shall be a time of anguish, such as has never occurred before. But at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. And here is where we finally get to the payoff, or the sense of, okay, what is the book of Daniel telling its reader in this particular way of presenting its content? To answer that, let's focus on these people. The wise among the people shall give understanding. Okay, and there shall be a time for anguish for them, but at that time, your people, the wise, will be delivered. So, who are these wise? In the Hebrew, they are called maskilim. A maskil is someone who brings and gives understanding. The maskilim are the wise these texts have been talking about. In a time of just unprecedented and crazy, incomprehensible events, the time of Antiochus in Jerusalem, these maskilim offered in their conduct and in their testimony an understanding of the times in order to help Jews be faithful to the end. I'm summarizing what the book of Daniel says about them. They model for us their testimony in the stories of Daniel and his friends. Those are portrayals of the maskilim. And what they do at their time is they understand God's mighty sovereignty when others only see chaos. They remain steadfast when cultural hostility tests their commitment to Torah obedience. And they guide others toward righteousness when deception abounds. That was their mission. Their mission, as their world was falling apart, the eschaton, was to serve. The blue guy announced the victory. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth, some will awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. But those who are wise, the maskilim, shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like stars forever. Now, this is going to be, if you've read Revelation, this is familiar language. Okay. So there's an AI depiction. So let's sum it up. Let's connect the dots. The apocalypse in the book of Daniel is presented to us in these two forms, or in this frame. First, the stories of Daniel and his friends, which depict faithful endurance and service. Basically a portrayal of what a maskil looks like, okay, and the times in which a maskil operates: challenging, tumultuous, apocalyptic. Okay. Those are the stories. They are complemented by the visions that Daniel has, which portray mythic conflict, but nonetheless victory. So the takeaway, the situation towards the future, the orientation toward the future that the book of Daniel teaches its readers is this: there will be chaos, but also victory in the end. And so, in that chaos, be a Daniel. That is the takeaway. And if this has made sense to you, then we're ready for next week to learn what did Jesus have to say about this. That'll be our next session. Questions? Any questions? Thank you.
Where does Noah fit into all this?
Noah on the timeline is very, very early. The Noah story is pictured to us before Abram, before any of these kingdoms arose. It's what we call proto-history, or I've forgotten the other term, archaic history. It's interesting if you say that, because the Dead Sea Scroll people made a lot of Noah along eschatological lines. But we only had so much time today, so we didn't cover it. But on the timeline, not particularly relevant for this as far as we're concerned. Thank you for your question. Other questions? Thank you.
How did the people hear these stories? Because they probably didn't read.
Yes. Yeah, the question was, how did the people at the time receive and hear these stories, whether about Daniel's visions or about Daniel's adventures and his friends and so forth? We know that they were popularly circulated because the book of Daniel itself, we know, is an assemblage of these various stories that were in circulation. The fact that they were in more or less independent circulation, different episodes about Daniel and his friends, tells us that they were probably among the more elite in Babylonian Jewish society. This is very textually based. One of the stories, Daniel is studying the book of Jeremiah, which promises redemption at the end of the Babylonian exile. And so Daniel asks, is this the time? And the blue guy says, no, not the end of the exile. It's yet to come. And he projects the Antiochian situation and the redemption at that. So they were well received, but more probably by the elite. However, once they get baked into Scripture and that Scripture gets taught in Christian churches, many of these stories, the lion's den, the fiery furnace, make it very much accessible to the rest of us. Thank you for your question. Others?
So like last week we were typical for lessons like YouTube or something visual on the screen. So we found something called the Omega Code, or the apocalyptic code. You suggest a YouTube or some type of this series that could present, like that shows and offers this wonderful scenes like this.
Yes.
Do you suggest?
Okay, the question is a great one. The question has to do with modern media presentations of biblical content. And I have a strong bias. I want you to know that. I am an advocate for the literary presence of these materials. They are written to be read, not watched. They are written to be heard, not watched. But the image media is the dominant one in our society, and it's impossible to proceed without that. That's why I was so conflicted about showing you images, because it cuts short our own imagination. Okay, I've come to terms with that personally because in a classroom situation, showing is usually better than telling, so I'll do it. But in a church situation, I'm personally convinced that it's the liturgy, it's the reading, it's the personal imagination, which is actually the font of faith. I can't show you on YouTube the resurrection of Jesus, but I can imagine it some way by listening to the gospel accounts. And that imagination is actually the font of my faith, and it's true for you too. Now, back to the mass media, YouTube. As you can imagine, this stuff is just ripe for all kinds of YouTube spectacular stuff, and there's literally thousands of videos out there. Some of them are worthwhile. I'm compiling a bibliography for this class that in a later session I'll share with you. There is one reliable source. It's called the Bible Project. I recommend the Bible Project. They are media savvy, trained theologians who do a really good job of depicting. However, and they would agree with me, it's no substitute for reading and hearing on our own, if that's helpful. More to come. More to come. Yes.
Was there end time Islam?
Islam has a notion of the end time. And by the way, there are variations within Islam on that, and I'm not an expert on this. It's generally an expectation of divine judgment, wherein Allah ultimately rectifies everything by everyone's judgment, and some are judged to eternal perdition, and some are judged into eternal salvation in general. I've not done justice to it, but the short answer is yes. Thank you. Are we ready for a 1-week break? Come back next week.